Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today we're talking about tips and tricks for managing PTSD using natural methods and alternative medicine. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and the biggest hallmark of PTSD is flashbacks, typically. Flashbacks are where a person has unpleasant and intrusive thoughts that return to their head from either trauma that happened recently or trauma that happened in the past. And there's many kinds of PTSD. There's childhood PTSD, there's adult trauma PTSD that happened as an adult, there's complex or multiple or chronic PTSD where a person is exposed to multiple episodes of trauma, and so it builds and builds and builds in them. And so they get fatigued and they get chronic pain. They can often have this from a head injury, and it is comorbid with a MTBI, and comorbid means it occurs with another illness. So you get a traumatic brain injury, and that traumatic brain injury and PTSD go together. I want to remind everybody that PTSD can happen without a trauma, a physical trauma, a percussive or concussive or blast trauma. That means that a person can just witness something that physically is not violent to them, but that is emotionally violent and perceptually violent to them, and they get PTSD. So they don't need to have a blow to their head, they don't need to have a whiplash, although that can make it worse. What can happen is they have this recurrent thoughts, and they become avoidant to things and people and environments that are similar to the event that they experienced. They may avoid things that trigger them. They may have lots of triggers or a few triggers. The triggers may be paradoxical, like they may be perfectly fine walking through a firework display, but when a car backfires, they hit the ground. Very often this comes from war, but it also comes from childhood trauma, and it can come from adult trauma, and very often it comes from auto accidents. It's auto accidents, and the consequences of the auto accidents are a real justifiable cause of PTSD. The people can get paranoia and avoidance, as well as a sympathetic nervous response, where they can get things that are like panic attacks or anxiety attacks, where they have rapid heartbeat and sweating and they can't sleep. They may also have excessive sleep, the opposite of that. They will have difficulty in their relationships. Sometimes it will affect their work, and they become like a hermit and they stay at home. So one of the things that we want to start with in PTSD is assess the blood and find out, are there any blood-borne simple errors that we've missed? Like, you never want to miss the basics. So no matter what illness a person has, whether it's PTSD or thyroid or, beriberi, whatever, who cares, whatever the disease is, you always want to start with the basics, which is, do they have simple problems that can be illustrated by a complete blood count and a biochem profile and a urine analysis, which is a simple way of testing to see if we've missed anything metabolically. Then you go on to things like hair metal analysis, where you take a little chunk of hair from the back of the head. You can also use pubic hair for that, but you have to mark on the lab which one you choose, because there's differences between those two types of hair and the amounts of metals that are in those, and the results, reporting results, make a difference. You can also do urine tests for organic acids, which I talk about quite a bit. These are breakdown metabolites of a number of chemicals in the body and brain that come out of your kidneys, and we can use those to measure what's going on in your body and your brain. There's also a great test called the Dutch test, which is a urine test of adrenal function and sex hormones. This is useful for looking at PTSD, because if you enter, any person that gets PTSD from an event that's traumatic carries with them their entire health history when they walk into that event. So when you walk into that event, if you already have an anemia, if you already have a borderline hypoglycemia, if you already have a borderline diabetes, if you already have inflammatory chemistry, pro-inflammatory chemistry, if you already have oxidative stress, if you already have insulin resistance, these are things that you carry with you into PTSD. And when PTSD or MTBI occurs, mild traumatic brain injury, when those things occur, they weaken your brain's output. And when your brain's output is weakened, it doesn't control the body's systems as well. So all of a sudden, if you were to graph all the different symptoms and indicators and lab tests, many times a person suddenly gets worse, either right at the impact, or it takes a little bit of time afterward for the brain to slow down and they end up within weeks of an injury having a pretty terrible metabolic disorder that they only had a hint of earlier. So PTSD can make the brain affected such that the limbic system is affected, which again, the limbic system, if you open the brain up like this, it is a deep structure inside the brain on the midline, and that structure controls your autonomic nervous system, it controls your immune system, and it controls your endocrine system, which is your hormone system, along with the cerebellum. So this area can be injured emotionally, and it can physically fail to fire correctly so that you get an immune problem. Maybe you have a family history of autoimmune diseases that you never got. You get PTSD, and then you come down with some autoimmune diseases like lupus. And you say, well, what the heck? How did that happen? Your brain injury, which was not a physical injury, it was an emotional injury, caused electrical changes that were enough to weaken your immune system and give you an autoimmune attack or make you susceptible to infections. And there's plenty of infections going around the world now that we have to watch out for. So when a person has PTSD, it's valuable to assess them using their chemistry, and it's also valuable to assess them using neurology. So I think that people with PTSD should have a neuro exam, which is to say they go to a functional neurologist or a chiropractic neurologist or anyone who is certified in doing a functional neurological exam. And that process can take from 20 minutes to an hour or longer, and they test all different parts of your brain and your nervous system. Different lobes of the brain, superficial and deep, right and left, front and back, top and bottom, all the different regions of the brain and different parts of the cerebellum, the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves. And they test motor and sensory function and autonomic function. And they test extrapyramidal function, which has to do with unconscious control of your coordination and balance and timing. Getting a neurological examination can help localize if any areas are particularly weak or injured, and maybe even a person often gets PTSD with a traumatic brain injury because they see something traumatic and they often get injured physically too. They don't just witness things, they're part of the action. And so they get hit or struck or fall or roll or shot or they're near an explosion or a blast, and they are exposed to that energy, and that gives them a shock to their brain that's physical as well as emotional. And so those things are really unfortunate, and they have to be unwound with very careful care. The effect of QEEG and ERP, these are electrical tools. A QEEG is where you put a cap on a person's head and measure the natural brain waves that are coming out of their head at rest. And an ERP measures the natural brain waves that are coming out of your head when you're doing something. Usually these are highly structured tasks where a person is asked to tap a space bar or click a mouse when they see something or hear something change in their environment on a computer with headphones or a screen in front of them. And these are highly calibrated devices that are part of neuroscience today. And so you can find clinicians that can do that and measure how your brain is functioning and see what needs to be worked on and make measurable changes. So when they're working on you, they can show that your brain is getting better or not getting better or even getting worse sometimes. The excitement about that is that we can track and document a person getting better, which is what happens most of the time. One of the major problems that happens in PTSD is survivor guilt. Survivor guilt is where a person makes it through an event and they live, and the other people that didn't live through the event are dead, and they feel survivor guilt. There are other kinds of survivor guilt that are not as severe as death versus life, and they might be that a person got out with all their limbs and other people got out without all their limbs. So that a person that got out with less damage than the other people will experience survivor guilt sometimes. So this is a thing that needs to be counseled and talked about and discussed with your therapist and gone over, because there are people who will feel guilty even though they have no reason to feel guilty. They didn't cause the event, they didn't do the event, it wasn't their fault, and yet it's normal human nature to have survivor guilt. If children are involved, if you're a child or if you were a child at the event and you're an adult now, you need to pay attention to this because these dynamics can be very complicated. Also, if there were children involved and you are an adult and you witnessed children being involved, that can trigger some childhood issues and it can bring up stuff that is old. So when a person has PTSD, PTSD can trigger not just the event that happened and forward from that date. Like, for example, if I'm an adult and last year I was in a car accident and I have PTSD from that event forward last year, the PTSD injury to me can also cause me to dredge up pain from earlier in the life experience if I have any. So I might not only have PTSD about that event that happened a year ago, but I might dredge up PTSD from other events that had previously been settled. It's kind of like stirring up the bottom of a river or the bottom of an ocean. You stir up the cloud, and it can go back to childhood because PTSD does that. So a person may have flashbacks not just of the recent event, but of events way back in their childhood that were already resolved. So a person may have gone to therapy and resolved issues and had no issues for years, and they have an accident and all that stuff comes back. The good news is that we can usually help it and we can work with it, but it is a big deal to understand that those events can dredge up old, previously healed events and make them problematic again. And that's because if you think of it on a cellular level, the brain is impaired now. It's been injured emotionally, and it's firing electrically and chemically in an altered way because of the trauma, and we have to heal that process just as we would any other brain injury. So we treat PTSD, an emotional injury, like a chemical injury, an infectious injury, a traumatic injury, or just a plain old concussion. So it's really okay to think of it that way. Group therapy and buddy work works very, very well. Giving a person with PTSD a buddy helps quite a bit. Getting them in group therapy helps, and family therapy. Chiropractic and acupuncture help tremendously for PTSD. And I must note that transcranial direct current stimulation, which is a form of neurofeedback with electrical usage where current goes into your brain, is very useful. Neurofeedback without electrical current going into the brain is also very useful. QEEG brain assessment, as I mentioned earlier, helps guide neurofeedback. Deep limbic neurofeedback works quite well. And another thing is infraslow fluctuation. It's a form of neurofeedback with really low frequency waves, and they heal the brain quite a bit. So you can consider infraslow fluctuation, and there's several types of that are available with therapists that know what they're doing. And I think PTSD also responds very well to a counseling method, which is partly functional neurology method that counselors use called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, reprogramming, or repatterning, however you think of it. And Shapiro invented this particular method, and it involves moving your eyes in between sessions of counseling. So you might go to a counselor and talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then at every 10 or 15 minute interval, you'd stop for a few minutes and do some eye movements, or you might hold paddles in your hand and feel vibration in your hand where paddle vibrates and alternates. Or you might have headphones on and you hear a buzz, 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 and you just focus on that for a short period of time. And the theory of that is it seems to bring blood flow into the brain when blood flow is reduced when recalling trauma. And it seems to work very, very well. It was done in Oklahoma City at the Oklahoma City bombing, and it helped a lot of people get better. It's been done at the site of the World Trade Center attack and other places where there have been attacks and terrorism and terrible events and bombings where people are given EMDR therapy, and it really does mitigate the stress and trauma. So please always look at root causes, and please always look at chemistry and electricity and diet and nutrition when you're looking at even things like PTSD, because mental health responds to nutrition and biochemistry, and the brain is a biochemical organ.